Good. So I will start. Sorry, I will start with a question to kind of start stimulating the conversation, and I will just go around all the members of the panel. And the first question is, what would a good outcome look like in your area of expertise, or like the area where your initiative is, in 5 years from now and in 20 years from now? So just to set the horizon. So I'll start with Ian.
Okay, thanks. So for us and for many others, I think sort of access to data and having data that is well curated and interoperable is a key thing. So there's a lot of activities that are underway, both nationally and internationally in that area, but it still remains probably one of the biggest impediments to progressing, certainly the research end of things. So it can take a long time to get access to this data as well, and the amount of resource that needs to be put into that process is non-trivial. So it normally takes a major funding investment by either a funding body or a government organisation to enable that sort of thing. But it is not a solved problem despite all the effort. So in the near term, we need to make that barrier lower. We need to start collecting data that's already in that kind of format, that's already compatible with emerging systems for standardization. And really, ideally, they need to be globally interchangeable, not just nationally interchangeable. And I guess in 20 years, hopefully we've solved that one. And then we're on to actually really shortening the time span and making sure that all of the systems are in place to allow these things to go into real world use. So I guess that means dealing with regulation. It means dealing with approvals processes. It involves the public, getting people involved in that whole system so that they understand what is and what isn't being done with their data and what it's being used for. Because currently, although AI is doing really great work in the NHS, both in Scotland and in the rest of the UK, it is just the tip of the iceberg. So really significant long-term investment needs to be made to make sure that the timescale is shortened as much as we can. Yeah.
Okay, so from my perspective, it'll be just raising awareness of these devices that we have and the systems that we have so that we can start to use them in order to improve people's life. It's amazing that we have technologies that still, people are not aware of, even the medics or specifically the medics or people in care homes. So just raising awareness in the short term and also working with others in an interdisciplinary fashion so that we can use the data and predict from the data and so on and so forth. In the long term, it's just deploying these systems in a scalable way, and also such that they are interoperable with other infrastructure.
Okay, so if looking at a 5-year time frame, I'd like to see some of these switching technologies in gene therapies actually in the clinic in patients, basically making gene therapy safer and more effective for patients. So the other thing I would say is that these switches, whilst we chose to put the grant application into development for gene therapies, they could equally be applied in cell therapies, in biomanufacturing processes, and also in sort of regenerative medicine. So what I'd like to see is this type of technology branching out into a broader range of sort of therapeutic applications and biomanufacturing applications. As far as a 20-year time frame is concerned, I think that the kind of technology that we develop in here and that engineering biology could develop, you could use it to actually develop sort of sentinel cells where you actually develop cells that can sense the onset of a disease state, compute that, and then produce a therapeutic in a sort of closed loop system. So if I'm going to 20 years and I'm going to be ambitious, that's what I'd like to see. So actually have a system that maintains wellness rather than treats disease.
Excellent. Kev, I've saved you for last so you can do a bit of agitation as well.
Yeah, more around culture, just being much more innovative, nimble, less bureaucratic, and bringing people together. So fantastic talks, fantastic innovations, but we all know the biggest barriers are just limitless bureaucracy. I think there's a reason for bureaucracy, but sometimes there isn't. I think we've reached a point, the NHS is really struggling, and the capacity for the NHS to take things up is really small. We're now thinking how we look after our workforce. So I think technologies also help our workforce and the patients to work together collaboratively. and then somehow bringing people on missions, as you talk about how to get healthcare technologies rapidly pushed through. Definitely medics love all the stuff. We love all the gadgets. We love gadgets, but we just don't have the capacity because we just don't have the time to do it. So that's 5 years. 20 years, everything happens in 6 months.
Excellent, good. So the second question, I guess, relates a bit more to engaging with industry and collaborating with industry, and it's a double question. So the first part is what do you think is the most important need that the initiative that you lead is addressing when it comes to industry needs or kind of third-party collaborator needs? And the second part is, what do you think the unique contributions that research at an institution like the University of Edinburgh brings in versus what industry brings into that collaboration? What are the important parts? Again, starting with you.
So I guess the first thing is, I guess through our experience, industry are often interested in young talent. There's no doubt about that. So we have a great diversity of talent in the university, and so at all stages, not just the students. There are lots of talent that industry likes. Lots of novel approaches emerge from perhaps slightly more abstract research that happens here and gets used in places where it wasn't originally intended. We see lots of examples of that. And also a lot of companies effectively don't have the capacity or necessarily the skill base to do a particular niche activity. And that's definitely very, very productive. But I think it's increasingly, I've certainly in the last few years, I've seen a big closing of the gap in terms of what's happening in industry. Never has that been more obvious than with things like foundation models, where academia can't essentially train foundation models because they don't have either the people or the money to do it. And so I think there's a bit of an adjustment happening in these spaces where large data is involved, where there's more of a blending of the skills and experience, and that's a very positive thing. I've seen some really excellent projects emerge where the best of both worlds are meeting. And certainly some of the issues to do with data access and interoperability are things that large companies have often solved internally. And so it has been a very useful way for some of our research staff to actually get active on projects much sooner.
Okay, industry. So we're researchers and we develop new technologies, and we've been doing that. And we also educate researchers and PDRAs and who are the next generation of industrialists or researchers. Okay, I think what we need industry for is actually to take these technologies or help us with these, developing these technologies such that they are deployable, scalable, as I mentioned, interoperable with what they have. So we've been lucky here in the university. We work with Edinburgh Innovations, but when we develop technologies like the hydration system and other technologies, they also, allow us, give us access to industry experts. So we've been lucky in the case of the hydration system, for example, working with an industry veteran who's here, John Gilhooly, who is helping us with that, for example. So we need, what I'm trying to say is we need the industry in order to take these technologies and for them to be used and deployed, and also they are scalable such that they help the wider population, which is our aim.
Okay, so why do we work with industry? I think it's been spoken about. Industry can do that translation. If you're going to do a gene therapy, then it would be pretty hard for an academic to take it through sort of the clinical trials. So what you want to do is develop a technology and then partner with an industry partner to do those clinical trials. As I said, we've got a prosperity partnership with Fujifilm, and that works really, really well. And one of the reasons is that, so Fujifilm, they're a contract research organisation, and so their main purpose is to, deliver biologic drugs for pharmaceutical companies. And so they don't have the time to do the research. So, but what they've got is the cell lines, the skill set for the scale up. So what we've got is we can do all the sort of the underpinning biological knowledge. And then when you bring those two things together, biological knowledge, the time and the new technologies with the industry implementation, that's when you get really, really good stuff happening.
I think they should be there at time zero in every project, personally. I think that the industrial rigour and the quality management systems all the way from the beginning would be fantastic in some partnerships, knowing that only a few % of our talent stays in academia and giving that experience early on, and so they can move very quickly into the applied world. So I think we should have an open door, lean in, lean out, completely challenge-led. Imagine in 20 years' time, that's probably what will happen.
Good. So I will give out one more question and then see if there's see how the Slido is doing, and I'll just mix it up. I'll start from Susan now. So new technologies bring with them new considerations around responsibility, around ethics, and it could be anything really. And I just wanted to touch base kind of like with everyone, and I'll go all the way around, go back to you, Kev, as well. When it comes to ethics, when it comes to responsibility, what do you see as the main challenge in your field, and how can collaboration address that?
So obviously with sort of human sort of therapeutic, there's obviously ethical considerations. We have to take ethics into account in sort of how we do the research. But there are sort of set ethical processes around sort of therapeutic development and production. We also in engineering biology work an awful lot with our social science colleagues, and we're very serious about responsible research and innovation, and we really work with them and think about how we do research, why we do research, and how we can engage with the publics, and that can be the patients, or it can be the sort of the general public, etc. What I would say is interesting ethically in sort of the area that we're doing some stuff in is, I think pharma companies have got a driver for profit. So I think that we can develop some technologies, but whether they're implemented depends on whether the pharma company thinks that they can actually make some money out of it. So some colleagues have been developing gene therapies for diseases that are relatively rare. And so there's not necessarily the financial, well, there's a technology there to actually treat it, whether or not there's taken up. A level of it is whether the pharma company can make money out of it. So I would just throw that out there. That I think is an ethical dilemma, a bigger picture than an academic.
Excellent. Sir?
Right, so I think we're obviously with the technologies we're generating data, and we're using data, and we're giving it to AI, sophisticated AI algorithms to do whatever it does. Well, I think with this, we need to make sure that it's done fairly and no demographic is basically excluded. I think that's one of the main challenges. I think, and that could be addressed also through working in a multidisciplinary fashion with the industry, as well as social scientists, medics, as well as people who would develop the technology.
Ian, you're quite data heavy as well, I imagine. So
yeah, so I mean, I think we've touched upon a couple of things. So that for us, obviously, bias in models is a massive problem, as is explainability. So the more complex the models, the harder it is to actually understand what's happening inside. So there's a big push on causal AI to try to sort of get some mechanistic understanding of what's happening. I think the problem is perhaps underestimated, that it's often very hard to know if your model is biased. It's easy to know they're all biased. So the question is, how do you deal with that and how do you monitor that? So in terms of looking to the future, how do we regulate a completely new way of doing something? So we need to look to industry, I think, to help with this, because there have been really good examples in the pharma industry and in civil aviation and things like this, where continuous monitoring processes, pre and post release of products and things like this have been developed in partnership with governments. And I think that we have to think about what happens if you have an AI tool, for example, that's deployed and then is retrained, or maybe a demographic changes or some other parameter changes. So currently the whole field really doesn't, I think, do enough to really be very transparent about what they're doing and what the models are doing. So it's not just a question of hitting the FAIR principles or looking at reproducibility. There's so many additional features that go into building these models that are not captured. A classic example might be the recent AlphaFold paper that was published in Nature, but which doesn't release any of the information that you would normally associate with a scientific publication. It's a major problem, and it's something we have to get to grips with sooner rather than later.
Yeah, so 60 seconds on this. So ethics, morals, values are what make us human. And I think that we're in a real precipice of AI technology. So really lucky at Edinburgh, we have a Bailey Gifford Centre for Technomoral Futures, sitting in Edinburgh Futures Institute, which is trying to be at that bridge between the morality and ethics of the challenges of AI. I think it's the biggest challenge we face. And in Edinburgh, we're also working with the School of Divinity to recruit a chair of values, because I think we need to think about having that type of expertise at the beginning of all of the things we do. Often we build a technology, say let's think about the ethics of it. We need to build the teams of the companies, of the SMEs, of the new ventures with values and ethics at the beginning, and not think of it as a second string. And I think that requires us to think differently. So very passionate about it. So arts, humanities, social sciences, we have to bring in, we've got the medicine, we've got the engineering, it's time to go back to humanities, I think.
Excellent. I think we had the 3 rules of Isaac Asimov, the science fiction writer, but they're clearly not enough for today's AI. How are we doing for questions on Slido? Excellent.
We have a warning for a moral dilemma here. How should limited effort and funding be prioritized? Should the focus be on extending life or improving quality of life? And who should decide that? That's an easy one for you? Yeah.
No, it's not a Kev question, but I think it is the...
Maybe for that chair of values.
No. I think health, I mean, lots of people heard the phrase health span. You know, our health span is dropping, so we're living longer but with a lower quality of life. And our focus should be around prevention and early intervention. This could be biology prenatally, early in life, to live a better quality life rather than longer life. So I would say our focus should be on high quality life, not just extending life for life's sake.
Why can't we do both? Live long as well as improving the quality, I think.
I mean, there's some very cool things happening. So there's the Athena Command Centre in NHS Tayside as an example. So they've put in place essentially a kind of a real-time monitoring system that kind of looks for perhaps patients who are more likely to have a health event or to have an outcome. And so it's pretty cool to see that thing going into action. It's being apparently, I think it's also being discussed in another health board in Scotland and elsewhere. But it's that kind of thing you need, like you say, and it's connected up to the primary care system and things like this. So you want to basically be identifying high-risk individuals and intervening sooner.
And I think that's fantastic. It's a prevention. So there is an initiative here in Edinburgh joining Public Health Scotland with Police Scotland with the Scottish Government to think about early detection in the early years, thinking about lifelong events that we don't collaborate and share data enough around prevention. So public health, we need to bring them into the fold. They're part of the core activity. So that's all fantastic. Yeah.
You mentioned NHS there and government, and there's actually a question here about how could the NHS, the Scottish Government, help with the scale up and implementation and also with data sharing when it comes to accessing this data.
I could definitely say we've had this discussion around IG, information governance. There's a silo that exists, and it does require something quite bold quite soon with the new government. Well, it may not be a new government. Further. Sorry. But we absolutely need to be slightly more disruptive. And one of the elements here around data sharing is bringing the parties together in safe spaces to talk about what are the real honest challenges and facilitating true discussions about progress. So I think we do have a computer says no mentality in silos that exist around data sharing. The other piece in Scotland, there has been a shift towards something quite unique, which is NHS twinning across the test beds and TechScaler. So there has been a Scottish government state intervention to try and think about how we join innovation technology with the test beds to get the NHS having discussions, because the NHS is resource poor, time poor. And I do think one of the innovations is to, and this is really sad statistic, so I'm going to tell you this, that as medical students finish their medical training, they do 1 year as a house officer, and I would say currently 30% want to leave after 1 year, and they want to leave for Australia, and then they're going to marry Australians, they're never going to come back. But what are we doing? How are we training our workforce so that all the money we put into them and then they leave? So we're in a really difficult position. I think technology has a big part to play in terms of easing that pathway and also allowing our NHS young doctors, nurses to become much more innovative, allow them to be entrepreneurs, give them something to do. I'll stop because I've talked for ages on this, but we've got a workforce challenge, and can technology help to improve the quality of our workforce so they stay? That is the challenge.
I think you say, can technology help? Again, I come back. It's very difficult to let technology, like you said, into NHS or so I think if that is made easier, I think, for example, ethic approvals for NHS, it takes ages, and
I come back to the first thing, bureaucracy.
Yeah.
It is literally a point where we know there are nimble healthcare systems around the world, so why don't we look out and look at how they're doing things?
Yeah.
Again, I shouldn't be saying this stuff, but there are a few healthcare systems around the world that I would all love you to look at. One of them is called the Aravind Eye Care System in Tamil Nadu in southern India, which is the highest performing healthcare system in the world with 35% EBITDA. It has a system where you walk in, it's care-free for the poor, and people can pay what they want to pay. So it's like going right or left on an airplane. The destination is the same. They embrace technology, they innovate, they're nimble, they've broken down barriers because they have a value and culture system around the patient first. I know we all do. So I think it's around, the NHS has to change and it has to become much less bureaucratic. I'll stop there. I wear two badges. I've got a university NHS badge, so I better stop there.
We could maybe mention ICARE. I guess it's probably unfair not to mention ICARE. Yeah. So that's an example. You have two NHS trusts in Scotland that are working with Biomedical and Philips and a bunch of other companies. And what they're doing is not just the actual task at hand, which is really sort of developing technology that can complement their machines, but they are creating the infrastructure which could be used for completely different projects. So infrastructure around federated learning, data sharing, standardization, harmonization, all this sort of stuff is part of that project. And I've little doubt that a lot that will be learned from that project can be translated into completely different areas in the NHS.
We got two questions here that maybe I can link up, which are one is about data and how you decide which data to keep, and is data storage limiting? And the other question was perhaps related, but mentioning sensors as well. What further advancements are needed in sensors and applying electronics to be able to capture this data? So those two questions.
I think with the sensors, maybe I think there's been a lot of good work on sensors, I would say, and specifically the kind of work we do. I mean, some of the sensors that we tailor for care, we compare them against medical grade devices and so on. But I would say the key thing would be is just raising awareness and getting them into where they are, where they should be, like NHS, which I would repeat that. Is sometimes it feels like, that's the bottleneck for me. There are a lot of good, flexible sensor technology and data associated with it are being developed. But I think getting these to places like NHS is a challenge. Sometimes, sometimes you can get them into private companies, whether it be US companies but you can't get them to NHS where they could be of most help. So that's the frustrating bit. But there are, the sensors. I think key thing is there needs to be more work done on this, in my opinion, unobtrusive sensors where they don't restrict people. There's been tremendous advance in the wearables, but not everybody wears wearables, including me. I take it off. So when I sleep, so I think doing more on things like sensors of furniture, sensors around the walls and stuff. Where I think the challenge on that also, where do you store this large data and who do you make it available to? Some people, when we've talked to, is they want the data sent to them, actually. as I'm dehydrated, for example, I need to do something. That's just an example. Sometimes they want it to a family. Sometimes they do allow it to go to a carer or a doctor. So I think that's my insight.
And about the data storage, is that a limit currently? And how do you decide what to keep?
Well, ideally, you probably don't keep it. It's probably the solution. So we went through a period where everyone moved the same data around the world for weeks on end. And it's untenable. I mean, I guess probably the big push was when the data became so big that you couldn't push it around the world anymore. So nowadays, high throughput genomic sequence data, imaging data in biobank is only accessible within their trusted environment. Whether you like it or not, you just have to sort of shell into their environment and do your work there. But it means you're not moving petabytes of data around for no good reason. So we work with quite a lot of international data in the US. You simply can't move that data because it just takes too long. It's simpler to just buy a bunch of hard drives and put them in the post if you were allowed to do that than it is to move it on the internet. So you just can't do that. So we need to stop having 20 copies of the same big data set, and we need to just have resources where people can access those and have the compute resource they need to do the analysis there.
Should we do one more question from the audience? Or
Yeah.
Yep. So there's one here that, what are the barriers to working with industry, and do they mostly come from industry or academia? And what specific issues come up repeatedly from either side?
IP is the obvious one. It's just getting the agreements in place, working out who owns what, getting those collaborative agreements sorted initially is one of the biggest challenges. And I think culturally as well, to a certain extent, is industry works in a particular way, academia works in another way. It's just breaking down that sort of those different cultural barriers and to go towards the end point that is a win-win.
Yeah. And I think that's where generative AI and legal agreements would be amazing. So because the amount of time we spend on a legal agreement, surely it's just something much more structured, formatted, templated would be really easy. So we just move very quickly.
It's one for AI.
But I do think that is where there's an energy that comes together between industry partners and academia, and there's nothing more energy sapping than when the legal teams come in.
Yeah, I mean, to my experience, the problem's never with the science, So when the scientists start talking to each other, it's fantastic. And it's the gap between that happening and the thing actually starting that's the issue. And so, I think we're probably not really very smart at just renegotiating very similar things on multiple times. And we should probably try and move into an operation where we have memorandums of understanding or framework agreements, not just within individual company, but perhaps with groups of companies in particular areas or particular challenge areas. And that would save a lot of time and money, and it actually would facilitate interactions between more than one company and more than one academic institution. And so that should become the standard, I think, rather than these bespoke things.
And just there has been a jump. So I think Welcome Leap is the example, if you're aware of that. So Welcome Leap, for a good example, large-scale funding, there is a non-negotiable contract. Sign it or don't do it, which institutions have signed up. And I think that's probably the way forward. I think another funder, Lysimachos, going that way. There's non-negotiable contracts agreed, and so we just move. Yeah.
Or like you were saying, with Fujifilm, we've got an overarching collaborative agreement with them. So we've got multiple different projects, multiple different PIs. It's all under one big framework, and that makes things a lot easier.
Good. How are we doing for time? Do we have a bit more time? 3 minutes. We have 3 minutes. Okay, I'll do a slightly fun one. So someone at some point, probably in the early 80s or late 70s, decided to send an email, right? And that created a form of technology. And like if you look at how we communicate now and send, animated GIFs and memes through WhatsApp and all that, that has created a whole kind of like culture, something has emerged out of it. So what's in kind of like the area that you lead in, what's the next inflection point that creates that kind of like emergent whole thing? Susan?
I think in engineering biology, just being able to engineer biological systems just opens up like an insane number of possibilities. So what you've got with engineering biology is effectively a really big toolbox for engineering life. And so that is your massive inflection point, is developing those tools that can be applied in multiple different systems, multiple different organisms. And then it's up to people's imagination, and sort of how to control that is a different issue.
Anyone else?
I think linked to it is still 20 years post-human genome, the vast majority of the genome is still dark. Most of the variants that affect all of us, we each have 2 million different variants in our genomes. We don't know what most of those do. So it seems to me, given the direction of travel of everything else in the sort of data-driven domain, it seems that would be the next frontier for me, is really a step change in how we understand our genomes. That's probably the big one.
I think for me it's basically gathering data and from sensors, and also using AI in order to enhancing people's experience, specifically, for example, people living with dementia, living at early stages of dementia. And it's just basically using that in an interactive fashion. That's where data needs to be obviously also scrutinized and buffered and so on and so forth. But I think there's a huge opportunity in that, So using all these sensors, whether be it in home or even people may have them as well, and also try to enhance, people's living. And so I think we have a project in that specifically that's addressing that. So I'm very excited about it.
I think it's probably our children's mental health and well-being. I think we're at a precipice of technology, and we've reached a point of humanity where we're being immersed in it, and our children are really struggling. So I think one amazing flip would be something that happens where we've got interventions, predictions for our kids, and or protecting them from all this stuff. They can be kids again. Can we do technology? Can we do something where we can screen the AI? Can we monitor that? I think that would be an amazing flip in the next few years.
Excellent. So will you please join me in thanking the panel members?